So it's been a couple of weeks since Nabeel has moved to New York. Welcome to New York, Nabeel. And Nabil is a senior product manager at Amazon, as well as being a startup mentor, as well as being a guest lecturer at Columbia. In this episode, we get to see the Bengali side of Nabil, as well as his career journey being a product manager. Welcome to the podcast, Nabil.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I just got to New York a couple weeks ago, so super excited. I've seen the page before, so happy
Yeah.
to be on the podcast.
Yeah, so it's only been a couple of weeks since you moved to New York, and where have you been before that?
Yeah, so I'm originally from Atlanta, Georgia. My both my parents are from Dhaka. I
Yeah.
previously went to the University of Michigan. I used to live in Charlotte, and I traveled a few years for work. So I actually had been splitting time between New York and Atlanta for the past couple of years. And now, like you mentioned, I just got here full time a few weeks ago. So really excited to settle here and be here for the foreseeable future.
So how was it like living in Atlanta?
Yeah, it's really nice. There's a really nice Bengali community is there as well. It's a community I got to grow up with, who I'm very grateful for. A lot of my close family, friends, and relatives and whatnot too. So it's definitely different than New York, the city, in a lot of different ways. But it's a
Yeah.
nice place and it's got its own community too.
So if you had to say like, is we discussed this before when we called before, right? How is like the food in Atlanta, Bengali food in Atlanta?
Yeah, I'd say the Bengali food scene in Atlanta, it's definitely, I don't think it compares to New York. New York's probably got one of the
Oh,
most mature Bengali
yeah,
food scenes in the country, or maybe like a few spots in the world. I think a lot of what I had kind of when I was in Atlanta is really the home cooked meals, the community based meals.
yeah,
I spent a lot of time with family and friends, and I think there was many weeks or months where I was getting Bengali food from neighbors, and that I think meant a lot to me. But definitely the scene in New York, excited to try out all the different restaurants, some of the famous places here. So the restaurant scene's less developed, but the community is wherever you go, I suppose.
yeah. I mean, you should definitely like the Bengali hotspots here, Hillside, Trial Hillside, Jackson Heights, like all these areas. Like there's even Brooklyn, like Brooklyn Bengalis. You just gotta try out like all these
Mhm.
different places and see uh, where you like best. So, let's go back to when you were a kid. Like, let's say you're 10, 11, 12, or even your teenage years, right? How did you view being Bengali back then as compared to now? Like,
Yeah, I
did you
think
struggle with like? Yeah, go ahead.
I think one of the things for me is I definitely enjoy and I appreciate my Bengali heritage. I think a lot of things about my life and the way I do things are relatively unique or I'd say uncommon. And I think being Bengali to a degree is one of those. Like it's one of the community has definitely grown a ton over the past 10, 20 years in various parts of the US, but definitely at the time, I remember when I was a kid growing up, like most people didn't even know where Bangladesh was on a map. Most people like the only time you really were like Bangladesh was mentioned was in like global statistics around things like
Yeah,
poverty, etc. So like people didn't really recognize it. People didn't see it as being different from India. I've had the fortune of being able to go back to Bangladesh every couple of years. I try to go
yeah,
every 2 to 3 years if I can. And so I've really always enjoyed the community, and I think like it is a central part of my identity and something I want to kind of keep forward as well. So I've loved to see its national relevance kind of grow over time, and so I'm really appreciative of that.
yeah. Speaking of that, so you grew up most of your life in America, right?
Mhm.
So did you
Yeah.
have any Bengali role models that you looked up to?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, when it comes to role models, right? Like, I think the biggest thing, as kind of corny as it might sound, is literally like like the uncles, like my friends, parents,
Yeah,
their brothers and sisters and whatnot. I again, having a community of people, I had people who were not only just adults, but even friends that were just a few years ahead of me. So, like, some of my friends who maybe were 4 to 5 years older, having close connections with them, seeing how they progressed, it's kind of like having a mentor that's like 1 or 2 steps ahead of you and then seeing somebody who's further down in life than you. So I was able to kind of get a little bit of both. In terms of like Bengali like business or like job based mentors, I would say not as much, but I think most of what I've seen was definitely like connections that I got by way of having that integrated community. So I met a ton of interesting people who were doing cool things within the business or like technology landscape through the people that I already know.
Yeah, so it seems like a lot of the role models you had are just people you knew in real life, like uncles or your friends, families, adults from there. Did you have any role models specifically in the media, like actors, singers, or anything like that?
Yeah,
Entertainment.
I think it kind of comes down to like what you consider a role model to be, right?
Yeah,
Like so, the people who like if you look at the word role model, right? There's a place in society or a function in society that this person holds, and they're providing a good example of that to other people, right? So for me,
yeah,
the even though they were not famous by any means, like my friends and then my family, they showed me the role that they modeled was how to be successful as a Bengali person in America, both in your
right.
career and as an individual. So those people, that's why I'd say those definitely were role models to me in a way. When it comes to in business and technology, I think one of the things is I've actually been able to find more recently over the past few years, especially as I've taken like a just larger presence within the startup space specifically. I've been able to like visit New York over the past couple of years and see a pretty decent number of people who are doing very interesting things within business and technology that are also Bengalis. So I think those people, it's almost like the definition of a role model kind of continues to evolve. Starting with the people I knew who were again a few steps ahead of me, and then now even seeing people who are still trying to doing what I'm trying to do or in the direction I'd like to grow as well. So
I
less from
see.
movie and TV, is
Yeah,
it more from like real life?
yeah, I see. So, one specific phrase that you mentioned that stuck with me is success as a Bengali, right? How is that different from success as any other race?
Yeah, I think that when I kind of say that there's like a dualistic term of what it means to succeed as a Bengali. One is like you follow the traditional roots of success of like, hey, I'm doing well in school, I'm doing well in my job or in business
Yeah,
or music or whatever it is, and I am a Bengali person. So like I am succeeding and I happen to be Bengali. That's one thing. But I think the other thing is like more identity related, which is like what does it mean to be a Bengali person in the United States, right? So like
yeah,
how are they successfully navigating interpersonal relationships with their friends or interpersonal relationships with extended family or other groups of Americans and seeing how they either integrate well or maintain their identity, which I think is important as well. Like still express themselves and their Bengali identity, but also still are able to influence, integrate, and lead other groups of people. I think that's also succeeding as a Bengali as well. So it's kind of dual sided, and I was lucky to see people do both in different ways.
I see. So it's like um, with different elements to it, like just not just material success, but also how successful you are in relationships with your peers and friends.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
see.
100%.
Yeah, so let's shift a little bit more about since we're talking about success, let's shift a
Sure.
little more into your career, right? So you're right now a senior product manager at Amazon, right? But how did you get to that point? Like, was it back in high school, back in college, back in like at what point did you decide, hey, I want to be a product manager?
Mm. Yeah, so I actually, my career journey originally didn't start with the direction of product management. I actually entered college. I studied at the University of Michigan, studying material science engineering, with the goal of doing, so material science, for those who don't know, is like related to plastics and polymers. So it has nothing to do with software. I originally actually wanted to work in sports equipment. So like my first internship was with a company called Guardian that makes these like that makes football helmet covers. They're used in the NFL now. So I always wanted to be like a sports equipment designer. But really over time, what I ended up noticing, a lot of the materials jobs that I went to, they kind of pushed more towards like automotive. And I really, the big thing for me is I've always been somebody who wants to kind of be at the forefront of technology and be in kind of like an innovator and inventor. And so as I left school, I got towards the tail end of school. A couple of the offers that I had for jobs, the main one of them was in Toyota as a materials engineer, and the other one, this was during the pandemic, was as a operations manager or warehouse manager at Amazon. So at
Yeah.
the time, I considered the warehouse manager role to be the better path, just because it had more stability or like durability in the pandemic job market. And so what I ended up finding is that um, as I did more research throughout some of the different roles, I saw that as somebody who naturally had like a business interest, I've always wanted to do business full time. I still think that's something I want to do down the line. That product management was a role that sort of intersected between technology and business. Like you really kind of got to be quote unquote the CEO of a specific product or line of business. And so I found that to be something that I wanted to go towards. And so I kind of once I was in that operations management role, I kind of set my sights on product management. I was then able to move from operations to project management to product management. So which ended up I got promoted and was able to move laterally and ended up in a sort of senior product role within the span of about 3 years. So that's kind of how I ended up there.
So one thing you said is that product management is kind of like the intersection between business and technology, and that's kind of where I'm at. So, um, how do you guys collaborate with, let's say, software engineers or developers or other kind of roles that are purely tech?
Sure. Yeah,
Yeah,
so just for people who don't know exactly what product management is or how it differs from project management. So basically, product management is kind of like the visionary of any specific product, and that can be software or non-software related. Most contexts, it is software. So for example, let's say you want to work on Google Docs as a software. What is the product manager's job, high level, is to outline what does that specific piece of software or what does any product look like over the next 1 month, 2 months, all the way up to 3 to 5 years. So you're really a future sort of like vision setter. And so what that really means is that as you outline sort of the future vision and direction for this product or this piece of software, you also, that means you have a long term vision and a short term vision that gets to iterate into the long
yeah,
term vision. So, what happens is you're generally working with, as you progress along that long term vision you have, let's say you're working over 3 years, you are working with engineers each step of the way to actually build that step. So, you say, hey, over the next 3 to 6 months, I want to improve Google Docs so that you can share files with other people, and let's say you could use AI to like summarize documents or something. So that type of a feature, what you basically are doing is you're outlining what that feature is going to look like. You're working with the engineers to actually write the code and create the documentation. And then you're testing the feature and pushing it out to the market. So you're the one who really decides here's what goes into the product now and in the future.
I see. So, um, you said it's like more of a long-term vision, right? So how the product looks like, this year, next year, over like the next 5 years, right? And one thing that has been interesting with a lot of products lately is that we now have AI and it's advancing at a rapid rate, right? So how does the future of most products, most tech products, look like with AI involved?
Yeah, so there's kind of like there's a portion of it that is changing in terms of how the product management process is done, and then there's a portion that is changing of like how the actual products are evolving. So one of the big sort of trends in terms of how the tools themselves will continue to evolve or software will continue to evolve is that, like, for lack of a better term, it'll continue to get smarter. So the high level term is that we're looking at ways to take repeatable processes that a person would normally do and enable a software tool or an AI based tool to do that instead. So let's say, for example, in today's world, a financial analyst might look at thousands of documents a day and review which ones are either above the budget that's allowed for this project or below the budget, let's say, for example. So an AI tool might be able to scan through a lot of those documents very quickly, find outliers, and route those to the human for review, and then sort of, let's say, auto approve the rest of them. Because if 9,900 out of 10,000 are within budget, say, hey, all you need to do is sign off, then the AI tool might be able to do that. So a lot of it is it's what's called human workflow automation, which is like what are the repeatable processes that knowledge workers are doing today that we can sort of automate and have a software tool do independently. Whereas in the past, a lot of the software tools were geared towards enabling a person to always do the task. So it's transformation from person doing the task to software doing the task and enabling the person to do the rest. That's kind of the way it's changing over time.
Yeah, I see. So it's a lot from seeing, okay, so what a person is doing that's repeatable, that, there is a pattern to it, and how you could automate that. And it's taking that into, I guess, AI, uh, following that repeatable pattern. And that's kind of speeding up that workflow. Am I understanding you right?
Yeah, yeah, 100%. So if you
Yeah.
just envision any sort of like thing that most people in their job might do 100 or 1,000 times a day or a month, those types of things, the AI tools want to take that out of the equation so that a person can do higher level strategic work or higher level knowledge work, and not have to worry as much of the on the base level tasks.
I see. So, how do you think it impacts a lot of the jobs that the Bengali immigrants in New York have?
Yeah, so I think it depends on like the if you look at the strata of jobs that people have. So most of the jobs that are, let's say jobs like working in restaurants or driving taxis or doing any sort of labor jobs, those actually I don't think will be impacted anytime soon. I think those jobs are a far ways away from being touched by AI, at least like 5 to 10 years minimum. In terms of those like mid-level, the knowledge workspace of like how immigrants, let's say it's an immigrant who works in software or works in project management, I think at the end of the day, like the tools that people have used in these roles have always evolved over time. People used to do all of their writing with like pen and paper. There's a lot of businesses that still do. Uh, Today, Excel is kind of like the backbone of most large companies in America. You'd be surprised how many giant corporations are holding together their processes with Excel documents. And so I think a lot of those sort of like routine processes will end up being automated. Now, does that mean that the jobs themselves will disappear? No, but it does mean that the tools that are used to perform the jobs and the landscape of like users that do the jobs might look slightly differently. So I think there'll be some degree of more intelligent tool that involves another person having a higher level skill set to then use that tool. So like right now where people might be masters in Excel, they might be masters in using some degree of AI agent to do the same. Let's say you take an investment banker, right? Today they're doing tons of Excel, consultants are doing tons of slides. Tomorrow they might be using AI agents to do more deep research and formulate the sort of results a different way. So the tools change, the jobs change a little bit too, but it doesn't necessarily mean they go away.
So let's say that there is a Bengali knowledge worker. They're trying to upskill their knowledge with how to use AI tools, how to make the best use of AI agents.
Mhm.
What do you recommend to them?
Yeah, so I think the biggest thing is being familiar with some of the broader tools that are coming out today, like even the basics of knowing how to use ChatGPT. For example, that's a really if you have not used that, it's a really good place to start. Understanding how to looking at some of the stuff you do today and saying, hey, what are some of the very routine things I do, and where can it sort of augment or improve my existing workflow? Like if I write 10 documents a month or if I write 5 documents a month, are there ways that it can help me to speed up the process? Now, there's some strategies that kind of go into that. There's some prompting strategies or ways that you can improve the output you get from it. All of those things definitely, like if you do a little bit of research on, hey, I'm a knowledge worker, how can I get an AI tool to, how can I prompt an AI tool to provide me with better outputs for my specific scenario? That I would say is like a good base level of just going through and getting familiar with a tool that really supercharges your abilities. From there, if you want to learn a little bit more about how the technology works and just like understand the conceptual basics, that can definitely help too. But I think at the end of the day, like the main thing to think of is that in any time in the near future, AI likely won't take your job, but a person who uses AI might. So, like being familiar and like fluent in the tools is more important than I think than necessarily understanding all of the technology that goes underneath. Obviously, it depends on the role, but if I'm to give you a broad direction for like most knowledge workers, I would say that's the familiarity is the way to go.
What was the last sentence? Last two sentences.
Yeah, yeah. So at the end of the day, right, the thing that's important is as a knowledge worker, like
Yeah.
having fluency and familiarity with the tools is better than necessarily knowing how all of the technology works. So like working with some sort of AI tool, doing research on what sort of prompts that you can use to sort of augment your specific workflow, saying, hey, if I was to in general be a, let's say I'm a financial analyst, I have to write 10 documents a month. How can I train a specific AI to help me do my job faster? All of that definitely will help. But again, what I would say is that like a person, it's not necessarily that AI will take your role, but a person using AI might. So being
Yeah.
fluent and familiar with the tools that are coming out is going to be the most important.
That's very interesting because I heard that a lot. So like AI won't replace you, but a person using AI will, right? So that begs another question, right? How much more productive is the person using AI compared to the person not using AI? Are they like twice as effective? Are they like five times as effective, or could they be like 100 times more effective if you just use AI?
It depends specifically on like what the role function job is.
Yeah.
I mean, so I've looked at use cases where like in finance, somebody was summarizing like news reports that would come up for investment banking analysts, and
Yeah.
basically they were able to train a model to say, hey, look for specific things in these reports and tell me what trading decisions I could make. Now, that would enable them where they might spend a couple hours a day reading each document, they could read dozens or hundreds. So, does that mean that they necessarily output a higher number of trades? No, but it means that there's a lot more data and analysis that goes into each one. So, you can theoretically say if you want to measure that effectiveness, it really depends on, it's not necessarily that you're just outputting more of a specific deliverable, but it does mean that the deliverable that you output is significantly more effective and impactful, which is the main thing. So that type of thing. Again, it depends largely based off of the role, but it's more about using the data, using a large set of data which is trained within this model to be able to make a smarter decision or a smarter, like do your work smarter rather than doing everything more difficultly based off of volume.
Yeah. So how do you personally use AI for your workflows?
Yeah, so one of the things that I'm kind of advocating for right now is the field of product management evolving a little bit based off of AI. So in the past, some of the things that I do specifically with it, like product managers, what we do is we write a lot of documents and do a ton of research summarization that goes into our document findings. They're almost like research papers or like technical spec documents that we write for everything. So I'm now able to use an AI to take a lot of the research that I'm doing and better summarize it in a way that provides that backbone for the document I need. So it, in some ways, speeds up the actual process of writing the document, but it also helps with things like idea generation as well. So if I'm stuck at a certain point and I need to use it similarly to like a Google search engine, I might do that. If I want to find ways to write again parts of a document, I can help with that. It's really good. As it's almost like it's kind of like having a consultant in your pocket, where you sort of are able to talk to it, get outputs back, etc. So that's in some ways I use it. Search, document writing, a little bit of discovery. Those are kind of the main three areas that I think would probably most people could probably try and use tomorrow.
So it's mostly for searching and a little bit of writing and like a lot of searching,
Mhm.
right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So a more specific question I had with the product management, right, is that there is different kinds of products. So products for businesses and there's products for clients. What's the difference between B2B products versus like B2C products?
Yeah, so high level, kind of like you described. So a B2B or a business to business product, and then there's B2C or business to consumer product. So a consumer product generally is going to have much less complexity in how it's used than a business to business product. Largely because, so let's take two apps, for example, right? If I say Uber as a B2C or business to consumer product, which is going direct to any individual user like you and myself, there's only a few things that you're really doing in Uber, right? Like you're booking a ride, you're showing up to the ride, you're paying for the ride. Like that's kind of the whole thing. Now, the way they present that experience or that present that information can be shown in different ways, but for the most part, it's usually a pretty simple workflow. A business to business software or business to business product management usually involves much more detailed processes that you're building a tool around. So if you take, for example, a tool like Asana as like a project management tool or a tool like Notion, there's a lot more sort of features and complexities that these tools have. Like there's tables, there's views, there's like calculations in the tool that have to be somewhat flexible to meet the needs of a business that is doing a workflow. So that's kind of the main thing. The difference is again, one of them is geared towards an everyday user. The user interface and experience is usually much more simple, and it usually covers a specific task where it's like, hey, I want to do X thing. I want to book a ride, so I use Uber. I want to get a restaurant reservation, so I use OpenTable, and that's all I do. Whereas like a business to business tool is a ton more complexity, usually covers a lot more scope of work, which is usually related to again a person's job within that customer business.
Just curious, is there a specific product like that you really like and you think was executed really well?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot of them, and if I would honestly use the two examples that I talked about. So Uber is a good one. I usually use like when I do case studies for product management for people who are
Yeah.
interested in the role. I usually use Uber as like a pretty simple case basis. I mean, Airbnb is a product that I use a lot as well, so they make it pretty simple for people to try and book reservations. I also use a ton of like project management platforms, so things like Asana's pretty okay. Smartsheet is another one that's a B2B tool. Does a pretty good job of kind of highlighting and making like job workflows pretty easy. So there's a couple examples in like B2C and B2B space as well.
I see. And so let's shift over to more over your experience as a startup mentor. So,
Sure.
what kind of startups have you generally helped?
Yeah, so I've worked largely with a number of B2B and B2C consumer startups. Largely, some of the stuff I do on my own in my free time, and then some of it is related to like Amazon. So what I do is partially I partner with a team in AWS called the AWS Startups Business Development Accelerator,
Yeah.
where we find startups or they fund startups, and so they were able to put the workflow in there. So I've worked with companies, all different types of them. I won't share too much about the individual companies, just out of their confidentiality. But there's
Yeah.
both sides of the equation I've worked with.
And so, since we're talking about like being a startup mentor and we're talking about entrepreneurship, how do you think the Bengali community views entrepreneurship?
Yeah, I think that it's I don't want to say it's necessarily looked down upon, but I think that traditionally Bengali communities are slightly like risk averse. And it's for some good reasons, some bad reasons. You know, like a lot of our parents worked through a lot of like tireless situations or uncertain situations where the bottom scenario, like the floor of the scenario they could be in, if you've ever been to Bangladesh, you've obviously seen tons of people that are homeless or struggling very hard. And so their main goal was to provide a life that sort of avoided that and didn't lead to that at any state point in time. So some of the traditional fields like being a doctor and engineer that are kind of straight and narrow that are a little less risk averse and lead to less likelihood of what they saw as the bottom end. I think that's what they prefer. Whereas entrepreneurship, I think in some other communities, just because of those reasons, it is certainly, I think, appreciated in Bangladesh, but within the Bengali community that I've seen, but I think it's much less common and much less encouraged. Sometimes for good reasons, but then it might be in other places.
And how do you think we could promote more leadership and entrepreneurship within the Bengali community, at least in New York?
Yeah. Yeah, so I'll take that question in kind of two different angles, right?
Yeah.
So leadership can be done certainly within industry, and then entrepreneurship obviously is like running your own business. But I think there's the biggest thing I'll say is for the community to get involved with different types of people. So I think for myself, some of the experiences, like having grown up here with a large Bengali group of friends, as well as groups of friends in other areas, I think the biggest thing that like a diverse experience taught me is just how to appeal to the nature of each type of person, or how to appeal to a person's like desires or motivations. So just being able to know how to talk to people and work with people in a way that helps both people mutually. I think that's a very simple skill, but something that is oftentimes underrated, can be forgotten in competitive business environments, but really is a core foundational skill for people that are growing up and who want to kind of be business leaders of tomorrow. Whether you're deep into your career and you need a reminder of how to do that, or whether you're just starting out and you're maybe a student in high school, I think that's a fundamental skill. When it comes to entrepreneurship, like the big thing I'd say is, again, high level, the sort of tagline I'd say is get involved. Get involved with people, learn from your peers, learn from other people, see what people are doing. To be an entrepreneur, to be in an entrepreneurial environment doesn't necessarily mean you have to absorb all of the risk and be like your own founder. You can join a startup, a later stage startup. I have friends who are working in like Series B, Series C, or even later startups that are doing really well for themselves. They were in programs like Venture for America where they got some of that firsthand experience, but it's not as much of a direct risk as just starting your own thing completely by yourself. So just getting involved, learning about these programs, even if it's not something that you do full time, I think is a great way to encourage that sort of mindset within the community too.
And so let's say that there are a couple people that are trying to start a tech startup or whatever kind of startup there is. What advice do you have for them? Like there are things that they must know that before they get into this field of just starting a startup, whether it's with their friends or just like strangers or other people.
Sure. Yeah, I'd say the biggest thing is keep your customers' motivations the core of your business at any point in time. So there's sort of like a concept that Jeff Bezos has talked about at Amazon, which is kind of like working backwards from the customer, which means that oftentimes, sometimes in business you hear that like the customer is always right. And that's not really the case. Like sometimes, you are always trying to build something that the customer needs, but it's not always what the person will tell you. Like sometimes they say one thing and they do another thing, or their behavior yields different trends. And so by understanding what is the core problem that you're trying to solve for your target audience, using the data to identify what that trend is, keeping a close connection with them to see what they tell you, and then iterating and trying to deliver value at any point in time, that's going to be the biggest thing. So it's how can you establish yourself as somebody who like understands your customers, is able to build something for them, and truly delivers value at every step of the way. Whether you're in a local business like a restaurant, or whether you're starting a tech startup, that advice goes kind of either way. So it's keep a close connection to your customers and build on their behalf.
And when you're first finding your startup, how do you find your first few customers, like first 10 customers, first 100 customers, and how do you scale from there?
Yeah, I think it's gonna be like the first customers are oftentimes the hardest. It takes honestly it's just a lot of like work. Like sometimes it's people in your network. You might know people who have, like, let's say you do a B2B startup, right? You might know people in your network who have a business or who work in a business who could use your product. Doing that is different. The model is like fundamentally different whether you do B2B or B2C. If you do B2B, what you are looking for is known as a design partner, which is basically you're trying to get somebody to kind of quote unquote believe in your idea and say, hey, like we're agreeing to use this product. We might pay for it down the line, but we want you to kind of build it with us, and we'll use it. We'll see how it goes. That's kind of like the essence of a design partner. You can kind of emulate the same model with a B2C company as well, where you're able to take like a group of people, do deep user research, etc. But really, like when it comes to B2C, you're going to have to probably work a little bit harder. It's less of like sales led, it's more so just talking to individual people, trying to get feedback. And then from there, when it comes to growth, you want to find like what is working for these people, what is going to lead the next person to sign up. The big thing is, again, like thinking through that whole working backwards from the customer problem, how can you think about how you can deliver value through each part of their journey and then have it be something that they are either advocating for outside of your platform or are sharing with somebody else through your platform. That's usually how growth is thought about as well once you get the first few.
Yeah, so for startups, you talked about how to talk to the customers, the market, to make a better product, and we talked about how to find the first few customers, first 10, first 100. Now the question is, let's say that you're trying to raise funding. How do you find investors for a tech startup?
Yeah, so investors, it's a slightly different ball game. Like the good thing is like they're companies, right? So they're looking for companies to fund as well. So they're not like hiding. There are databases that you can go out and find them. They will generally take emails or they will take calls, etc. They usually what you're trying to present to them is some form of pitch deck or pitch one pager of your idea. When it comes to like if you're in New York, I would say try to get involved with startup events or tech events wherever you can. Generally, you'll find some degree of like a connector or like let's say an advocate for these companies or these venture firms that can introduce you to a company or several companies. That's the biggest thing. Like you have to kind of put yourself out there to get known, or do a ton of cold outreach to these companies to say, hey, here's my deck, here's my idea. So it does take really a lot of like work as well, but it's certainly something that is I would say worth the effort.
So we talked about you being a startup mentor, and you gave some really good advice on how to find your first startup, how to find the customers, how to find product market fit, how to find investors. Uh, let's talk about a little bit about your experience being a guest lecturer at Columbia Business School. So how is that like?
Sure. Yeah. So I was able to get the opportunity to do a product management lab or instruct a product management lab at the Columbia Business School, so for their MBA program. This is something I had been working on for almost a year, and we were able to do our first lecture within the last couple of weeks. Basically, was able to connect with the professor, get a time set up with them. Really, it was a really interesting experience because I wasn't as somebody who is again, my story is that I was one of the youngest senior product managers at Amazon. So
Yeah.
even though I have a degree of like experience within the industry by age, I'm not too much older, or I'm actually even younger than a lot of these MBA students. So it was nice for them. The big thing to be able to speak to somebody who is relatively in the same age bracket as them, but also in the job that they would be looking to do. Because it's somewhat common for people to go from MBA programs to like a senior product management role. It's kind of like a somewhat established pipeline. And so them being able to talk to somebody in that role was certainly, I think, valuable for them too.
That's cool. So, I mean, right now you're a senior manager at Amazon, and you were there at like a really young age, right? So, what goals do you have for the future? Are you trying to
Yeah,
like get promoted, start a new startup, or what's the what's the vision for the future?
Yeah, so right now, I have a community of product managers that I run called PM Teach. That's roughly 1,200 people. What I'd like to do in the future, like eventually down the line, I want to go into my own business. I want to talk too much about like timelines and whatnot, but basically the goal has always been I started my first sort of like side business or like a small business when I was in high school with a friend of mine. So it's
Yeah.
always been something I have the kind of natural sort of appeal for. Down the line, I'd like to do something that really impacts education using AI. So I come from my grandmother was a teacher in Bangladesh up until like a year or two ago. My mom was a teacher in Georgia. And so really the education space, and obviously as you see, I do a lot of teaching and mentoring as well. So education is something that's always been core and central to my mission, and like what I've helped myself sort of evolve my career through. So using kind of evolving how people um, are educated in the future using AI
Yeah.
is where I'd like to see myself in the future too.
So you're focusing mainly on education. So is it mostly online education, or do you plan to open up like boot camps in real life or anything of that nature?
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, I think it's a little bit hybrid for right now. So like I've
Yeah.
done some stuff that's, as you've seen, I've done some that's in person, like through the guest lecturing. My community is largely digital. The thing with digital education is I'd like in the future to grow a software platform, but I also want to have like a live or even like a virtual cohort element to it too. That's something that is important. I think people get a ton of value out of having that human connection. It's really what delivers like the premium experience within education because it just delivers more of a personal touch than just doing some form of like online course or anything of that nature. So it's probably gonna the experience I would like to design for what AI based education in the future looks like is probably a hybrid of that. Some of that might be in person too, but I think using the digital mechanisms of like virtual cohorts or asynchronous sessions is probably the way I see things going at scale.
Yeah. So I mean, um, as we wrap this up, is there any advice or is there anything you would like to say to, let's say, that a Bengali teenager watching this that are trying to either go into product management or trying to start a startup, right? Just what's your message to the Bengali youth?
Sure. Yeah, I think the biggest thing I would say is that like I think my journey again has been sort of unique in an odd number of ways. I know we don't have time to cover all those, but definitely like your own individual story is what you make it. It's not necessarily just the sum of its parts or the sum of like what your parents told you have to go to. So I think like work whatever you try to do, commit yourself very fully to that path or idea. I think the biggest thing is like work hard at whatever you do. Try to be the best at whatever you can, but also just know that like whatever you can and whatever you want to go towards is your own choice as long as you commit to it 100%. I'm all for people taking diverse or different paths, as long as you try your hardest to be your best at it.
Oh, thank you. So, if people wanted to learn more about you, how can they connect you? What are your socials?
Yeah, yeah. So I have, they can reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm happy to share the link to that. You can also reach out to me on my Slack community. It's a free Slack. It's pmteach.slack.com is the address. Happy to connect with any people on LinkedIn there too.
All right. Thank you so much for coming on to the podcast, Nabil.